You will be betrayed by your own blood. The psychic's warning to the millionaire. The clock read exactly 9:15 a.m. when Richard Morrison walked through the revolving doors of the imposing building that housed the Morrison Group headquarters. The echo of his firm steps on the Italian marble floor resonated throughout the lobby, while employees greeted him with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. At 45, Richard carried the aura of someone who had conquered the world with his own hands. Adjusting his Italian silk tie in the executive elevator mirror, he observed his reflection carefully. The tailored Giorgio Armani suit enhanced his impeccable posture, but it was his eyes that told the true story, restless eyes hiding a growing unease. The elevator opened directly to his executive penthouse on the 50th floor. His secretary, Amanda, was already waiting with a folder of documents and his traditional cup of premium Colombian coffee. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison. Mr. Philip is already in the meeting room waiting for the video conference with the Japanese," Amanda informed him, her heels clicking on the floor as she kept pace with her boss's quick steps. Philip, his younger brother by only 2 years, was his right-hand man in business. Together, they had transformed a small technology company inherited from their father into a conglomerate valued in the billions. The Morrison brothers' partnership was known in the market as an example of successful family business. Upon entering the meeting room, Richard found Philip hunched over his laptop, focused on a spreadsheet. His brother raised his eyes and smiled, that charismatic smile that always opened doors in business. "Richard, we need to review some points before the call with Takeshi Corp. I have some suggestions for structuring the merger that could maximize our return," Philip said, his voice conveying that characteristic enthusiasm that always infected those around him. However, something in the way Philip gestured, in the way his eyes slightly averted when mentioning certain details of the negotiation, began to awaken an uncomfortable feeling in Richard. It was as if a distant voice in his mind was trying to alert him to something his eyes couldn't yet see. The meeting with the Japanese executives proceeded as planned. Takeshi Corp was interested in merging its technology operations with the Morrison Group's most profitable division, a negotiation that could result in a $2.5 billion deal. After the video conference, while organizing his notes, Richard noticed that Philip had received a message on his cell phone that made him frown for a moment before quickly tucking it into his jacket pocket. "Any problem?" Richard asked, trying to maintain a casual tone. No, just Allison asking about tonight's dinner," Philip responded, referring to his wife. But there was something in his voice, an almost imperceptible dissonant note that reminded Richard of an event he had tried to ignore in recent weeks. Exactly 1 month ago, during a moment of particular anxiety before an important negotiation, Richard had done something he would never publicly admit. He had consulted a psychic. It wasn't something that matched his rational, calculating personality, but the anxiety he had been feeling led him to seek answers in unlikely places. The memory of the psychic's words echoed in his mind, "You will be betrayed by your own blood." At the time, he had dismissed it as superstitious nonsense. Now, observing Philip's subtle movements, the way his brother seemed increasingly anxious to accelerate the merger with the Japanese, he began to wonder if he had ignored important signs. "I need to travel to Singapore next week," Philip suddenly announced. "There are some investors interested in learning more about our operation in Asia." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Singapore? I don't remember us discussing investors from there." "They're recent contacts," Philip explained naturally. "I thought it best not to overload you with another negotiation while we're focused on Takeshi Corp." The explanation seemed reasonable, but something in the pit of Richard's stomach contracted. Years of business experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and at that moment, his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. At the end of the day, sitting in his office overlooking New York City, Richard began making connections that previously seemed scattered. Philip's increasingly frequent trips, meetings not listed in his official schedule, phone calls at strange hours that his brother always answered while moving away from others. He picked up his phone and made a call to Hans Mueller, an old contactee. In the financial market, known for his discretion and efficiency in obtaining sensitive information. "Hans, I need a favor. Richard said, his voice low and controlled. "I want you to investigate some recent movements. I'll send you the details by email. Maximum discretion." As he typed the email to Hans, Richard felt the weight of his suspicions growing. If he was wrong, he would be betraying his own brother's trust. But if he was right, the prospect was even more disturbing. The days that followed were an exercise in self-control for Richard. During board meetings, he observed Philip with increased attention, noticing small details that previously went unnoticed. How his brother subtly directed discussions to certain aspects of the merger, how he emphasized certain advantages while minimizing obvious risks. On a particularly tense afternoon, Richard received an encrypted email from Hans. The investigator had discovered a series of unregistered meetings between Philip and representatives of an Asian investment fund, Golden Dragon Capital. The meetings took place in discreet hotels in different cities, always away from the market's eyes. "Mr. Morrison?" Amanda's voice brought him back to reality. "You have a lunch scheduled with the Peterson Technologies board in half an hour." Richard adjusted his posture in the Italian leather chair. Peterson Technologies was a recent acquisition, part of the expansion strategy that he and Philip had planned together. Or at least, that's what he thought until then. The restaurant chosen for lunch was Le Bernardin, one of New York's most exclusive establishments. While waiting for the Peterson executives, Richard couldn't stop thinking about Hans's discoveries. Golden Dragon Capital had a known reputation in the market. They were specialists in hostile takeovers disguised as friendly mergers. "Richard, what a pleasure to see you." The familiar voice of Charles Peterson, chairman of Peterson Technologies, interrupted his thoughts. "I was just commenting to your sister-in-law, Alison, about the excellent results from last quarter." Richard froze for a moment. "Alison, she's here." "Yes, didn't you know? She's representing a new group of investors interested in our partnership. I thought Philip had informed you," Charles replied, clearly noticing Richard's sudden discomfort. Alison appeared elegantly dressed, her green eyes showing a confidence that Richard had never noticed before. "Richard, what a pleasant surprise. Philip mentioned you would be busy today with Takeshi Corp." Richard's mind was working at 1,000 miles per hour. Alison, with a degree in international business, had always kept herself distant from family business, preferring to dedicate herself to social projects. Her presence there, representing investors, was intriguing to say the least. During lunch, Richard maintained a facade of normality, but every word exchanged seemed loaded with double meanings. Alison dominated the operational details of Peterson with surprising familiarity, as if she had been involved in operations for months. Back at the office, Richard cancelled all his afternoon meetings and locked himself in his room. He opened his laptop and began meticulously reviewing every document related to the merger with Takeshi Corp. That's when he found something alarming, an apparently harmless clause that, if activated, would give the majority partner the right of first offer on all companies in the group. His hands trembled slightly when he picked up the phone to call his trusted lawyer, Helen Vasquez. "Helen, I need you to analyze some documents urgently. And one more thing. I want you to discreetly investigate all corporate movements related to Golden Dragon Capital in the last 6 months." While waiting for Helen's return call, Richard received an unexpected message on his cell phone. It was from an unknown number. "Mr. Morrison, I have information about your brother that might interest you. Shall we meet tonight at 8 p.m. at Café Scene?" Café Scene was a discreet establishment in Greenwich Village, known for its select clientele and reserved atmosphere. Richard knew it could be a trap, but his intuition told him he couldn't ignore that message. At 7:55 p.m., Richard parked his Mercedes on the side street next to the cafe. The place was practically empty, except for a woman sitting at a table in the back, partially hidden by a flower arrangement. As he approached, he immediately recognized the face. It was Marina Sanders, a former executive at the investment bank that had structured the Morrison Group's last 3 acquisitions. "Marina? What's going on?" The woman indicated the chair in front of her with a discreet gesture. "Sit down, Richard. What I'm going to tell you will completely change your perspective on the merger with Takeshi Corp." And about your brother? Marina slowly stirred her cup of tea, her eyes fixed on Richard with a disturbing intensity. The soft aroma of jasmine hung in the air, contrasting with the tension of the moment. 6 months ago, I was approached by representatives of Golden Dragon Capital, she began, her voice low and controlled. They wanted detailed information about the Morrison Group's corporate structure. At first, it seemed like a normal market survey, but I soon realized there was something bigger at play. Richard felt his heart accelerate, but maintained his neutral expression. Years of difficult negotiations had trained him for this type of situation. Continue, he said, taking a sip of his espresso. Philip wasn't just in meetings with them, Richard. He was architecting a complex plan to restructure the group. The merger with Takeshi Corp is just the first part of a larger strategy. Marina paused, removing a brown envelope from her bag. Here's the proof of what I'm saying. Inside the envelope, Richard found copies of emails and documents showing a series of secret meetings between Philip and Golden Dragon executives. But what really made his blood freeze was a memo detailing a strategy to gradually dilute his participation in the group. Allison isn't just a casual piece in this game, Marina continued. She has a master's degree in mergers and acquisitions from the London School of Economics, something she conveniently never mentioned at family meetings. Richard remembered all the times Allison had shown disinterest in the family business, always claiming she preferred to dedicate herself to social projects. Now every gesture, every casual conversation gained new meaning in his mind. "Why are you telling me this, Marina?" Richard asked, his eyes carefully studying her expression. Marina adjusted herself in the chair, her posture revealing a mixture of determination and apprehension. "Because what they're planning goes beyond a simple corporate restructuring. They want to dismantle everything you've built, Richard. And she hesitated for a moment. "I can't be complicit in that." At that moment, Richard's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Helen Vasquez. "Urgent. I found something in the merger documents that you need to see immediately." "There's one more thing," Marina said, leaning forward. "Philip's trip to Singapore isn't to meet investors. He's going to meet with Golden Dragon's leadership to finalize the details of the plan." Richard felt as if the ground was moving beneath his feet. Years of partnership, trust and family history were crumbling before his eyes. But he was Richard Morrison, the man who had transformed a family business into an empire. He wouldn't be destroyed without a fight. "What else do you know about Allison's involvement?" he asked, his mind already formulating strategies. "She's more than just the dedicated wife," Marina responded, pulling another document from her folder. "Over the past 3 years, she has discreetly built a network of contacts in the Asian financial market. The social project she talks about so much, it's a front for meetings with Golden Dragon investors." Richard remembered Allison's numerous trips to Asia, always under the pretext of expanding her education project for underprivileged communities. Each piece of the puzzle was beginning to fit, forming an image he preferred not to see. "And there's more," Marina continued, her voice now almost a whisper. "I discovered that Golden Dragon isn't acting alone. They're just the visible face of a larger consortium of investors, all strategically positioned to take over different parts of the Morrison Group." The coffee had already cooled in Richard's cup, but he had hardly noticed. His mind was processing each piece of information, connecting dots, elaborating scenarios. Years of business experience had taught him that in situations like this, speed of action was as important as strategy. "Why would Philip do this?" Richard asked, more to himself than to Marina. "Power," she answered simply. "Golden Dragon promised him total autonomy over the group's international operations after the restructuring, something he always wanted, but never achieved under your leadership." Richard remembered the numerous discussions with Philip about international expansion. His brother always advocated for more aggressive strategies, while he preferred a more cautious and sustainable approach. "There's a board meeting scheduled for next week," Marina informed him. "That's when they plan to present the complete restructuring proposal. If you don't act until then..." Richard's phone vibrated again. It was a message from Amanda. "Mr. Morrison, Mr. Philip is looking for you. He said it's urgent to discuss some details of the merger. I need to go, Richard said, standing up. But before I do, Marina, I need to know, can I trust you? Marina held his gaze for a long moment before answering. You're not the only one who has something to lose in this story, Richard. I also have my reasons for wanting to prevent this. Plan. The next morning, Richard arrived at the office earlier than usual. The sun was still rising over New York when he met with Helen Vasquez in his office. The lawyer, known for her insight and discretion, had spent the night analyzing the documents. What did you discover? Richard asked, serving her a cup of coffee. Helen adjusted her thin-framed glasses and opened her folder. It's more complex than we imagined, Richard. The structure of the merger with Takeshi Corp was designed to create a series of intermediary companies. At first glance, it seems like a common tax optimization strategy, but, Richard encouraged, sitting in his chair. But these intermediary companies have a peculiarity. They all have clauses that allow automatic transfer of control under very specific conditions, conditions that coincidentally align perfectly with the scenarios that would be created after the merger. Richard felt a knot in his stomach. In other words, as soon as the merger is completed, these intermediary companies could easily be transferred to Golden Dragon Capital's control without requiring your approval. At that moment, the door to the office opened and Philip entered, his usual smile on his face. Seeing Helen, he paused for a moment but quickly regained his composure. Sorry, I didn't know you were in a meeting, Philip said, his casual tone contrasting with the tension in the room. But since I'm here, we need to discuss some details of the merger. Helen, could you excuse us? The lawyer exchanged a significant look with Richard before leaving, discreetly taking the documents with her. You've been absent lately, brother, Philip commented, sitting in the chair Helen had just vacated. Any problem? Richard studied his brother's face, looking for signs of the man he had always trusted. No, just some matters that needed special attention. How's the preparation for the Singapore trip? All set, Philip answered, a slight tremor in his voice, almost imperceptible. Actually, I came to discuss some points we need to align before my departure. As Philip talked about seemingly trivial details of the merger, Richard observed every gesture, every pause, every averted glance. His brother was good, very good. If it weren't for Marina's information and Helen's investigation, he would never have noticed the subtle manipulations hidden in each proposal. Philip, Richard gently interrupted. Do you remember what our father always said about trust in business? The younger brother paused for a moment, something in his eyes wavering. Of course, trust is like crystal. Once broken, it will never be the same. Exactly, Richard replied, getting up and walking to the window. The city stretched below them, a maze of buildings and avenues. And you, Philip, do you still trust me as before? The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Philip adjusted his tie, a habit he had when feeling uncomfortable. What kind of question is that, Richard? Of course I trust you. Then explain to me, Richard turned to face his brother, why Golden Dragon Capital? Philip's face paled for a fraction of a second before regaining composure. I don't know what you're talking about. You don't? Then perhaps we should call Alison into this conversation. I'm sure she could clarify some points about her social projects in Asia. Philip rose abruptly, his chair scraping on the floor. You're investigating us? Investigating? No, Philip. I'm protecting what our father built. What we built together. What we built? Philip laughed, a bitter sound that Richard had never heard before. No, Richard. What you built. It's always been you. You deciding, you controlling, you having the final word. I've always been just the younger brother, the advisor, the second in command. So that's it? This elaborate plan out of revenge? Revenge? No, brother. It's about evolution. The world is changing, business is changing. While you cling to your traditional way of doing things, you're missing immeasurable opportunities. Golden Dragon saw that. They understand my vision. Richard observed his brother with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. And Alison, is she also part of this vision of yours? Alison? Philip smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Alison is much more than you imagine, Richard. She's not just my wife, she's the architect of all this. Philip's words about Alison still echoed in Richard's mind when he arrived at Le Bernardin for a lunch that promised to be decisive. Helen had arranged a meeting with Margaret Chen, an executive from the Asian financial market, who might have crucial information about Golden Dragon Capital. The sophisticated restaurant atmosphere contrasted with the storm forming inside Richard. Dressed in an elegant Chanel suit, Margaret was already waiting for him at a discreet table at the back of the room. "Mr. Morrison," she greeted with a slight accent, "thank you for agreeing to meet me on such short notice." Richard observed the woman before him. At 50, Margaret Chen was a legend in the Asian market, known for her ability to predict and avoid major corporate crises. "Ms. Chen," Helen, "mentioned you have information about Golden Dragon that might interest me." Richard got straight to the point. Margaret took a sip of her green tea before responding. "Golden Dragon is not what it appears to be, Mr. Morrison. In fact, it's just a facade for something much bigger. Something your sister-in-law Alison knows very well." Richard felt his stomach turn. "Continue." Alison Wong, before becoming Alison Morrison, worked for one of Hong Kong's largest investment banks. She wasn't just a common analyst, she was a specialist in complex corporate restructurings. Her most notable work, helping develop the model that Golden Dragon uses for its acquisitions. The revelation hit Richard like a punch. Alison, the woman who for years had seemed so disinterested in the family business, wasn't just part of the plan. She was one of its main architects. "But why now? Why the Morrison Group?" Richard questioned, his mind working frantically to connect the pieces. "Because you're the missing piece in a much larger puzzle," Margaret explained, lowering her voice even more. "Golden Dragon is assembling a global technology conglomerate. They need a company with the Morrison Group's reputation and structure to legitimize their operations in the West." At that moment, Richard's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Marina. "Urgent. Alison just scheduled an extraordinary board meeting for tomorrow. They're going to advance the merger vote." Richard maintained his neutral expression. Years of difficult negotiations had trained him well. "How long have they been planning this?" 3 years, Margaret answered without hesitation. "Since Alison identified the first gaps in the group's corporate structure. She's brilliant. You know, she managed to map exactly where and how the group could be reorganized. The waiter approached to take their orders, but Richard could hardly think about food. His mind was focused on every interaction he had with Alison over the years, every seemingly innocent comment about the family business, every subtle suggestion that Philip had implemented. "There's something else you need to know," Margaret continued after the waiter moved away. "Golden Dragon isn't acting alone. They have support from a group of American investors, people you know very well." Richard felt his heart accelerate. "Who?" "Charles Peterson, for example. The acquisition of Peterson Technologies wasn't a coincidence. It was the first step in Alison's plan. The pieces were beginning to fit with frightening clarity. Philip's insistence on acquiring Peterson, Charles's sudden interest in expanding to Asia, Alison's frequent trips to Hong Kong supposedly for her social project. "And there's more," Margaret added, taking a tablet from her bag. "I found this in the bank's archives in Hong Kong. It's a document from 2015, long before Alison met Philip. On the tablet, Richard saw an old photo. In it, Alison was at a corporate event in Hong Kong, smiling alongside Golden Dragon executives. In the background, partially visible, was Charles Peterson. They knew each other," Richard murmured. "All this time?" "Mr. Morrison," Margaret gently interrupted him, "you're not understanding. Alison didn't meet Philip by chance. She was carefully positioned to get close to him. Their marriage was part of the plan from the beginning." Richard felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. The image of his brother, happy beside Alison on their wedding day, took on a completely new and disturbing meaning. "How do you know all this?" he asked, carefully studying Margaret's face. The executive smiled sadly. Because I was Alison's mentor at the bank. I trained her, saw her potential, and saw when she decided to use her talents for a much more dangerous game. Richard's cell phone vibrated again. It was Helen. Just received the documents for tomorrow's meeting. Richard, they have everything prepared. If the merger is approved, you lose control within 48 hours. Margaret observed Richard's expression change subtly. You have less time than you think, Mr. Morrison. Alison isn't the type to leave loose ends. If she scheduled a meeting for tomorrow, it's because she already has all the votes she needs. Richard left Le Bernardin with his mind in turmoil, driving his Mercedes through New York's chaotic traffic, almost by instinct. Margaret Chen's revelations had completely changed his perspective on the past few years. Each memory now needed to be re-evaluated, each moment reinterpreted in a new light. He parked his car in the Morrison Group headquarters garage and, instead of going straight to his office, decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He went to the 35th floor, where the company's dead files were kept. There, among piles of old documents and the characteristic smell of aged paper, he began his search. Mr. Morrison? The voice of Doris, the archivist who had worked at the company for more than 3 decades, surprised him. What a surprise to see you here. Doris, Richard smiled, genuinely happy to see a familiar and trustworthy face. I need your help. I want all documents related to Philip and Alison's international travels in the last 5 years. The archivist adjusted her reading glasses. That will take some time, but she hesitated for a moment. There's something you might want to see first. Doris walked to a specific file, her experienced fingers quickly locating a yellowed folder. A few months ago, Mrs. Allison came here requesting some old documents. I found her interest in such specific reports about the company's original structure strange. Richard opened the folder and began to read. These were documents from the founding of the Morrison Group, including shareholder agreements and corporate structures that his father had established. On some pages, small annotations in red pen caught his attention. Did she make any copies of these documents? He asked, studying the annotations. Yes, several. And one more thing. Doris lowered her voice, looking around as if fearing being overheard. Last week, she brought in a digitization team. They said it was for a modernization project of the archive. Richard felt a chill down his spine. Alison wasn't just planning a corporate coup. She was scouring the company's past in search of any vulnerability she could exploit. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Marina. Emergency meeting in the boardroom. Alison and Philip are presenting an important update on the merger. Thank you, Doris, Richard said, storing some documents in his folder. You've just helped me more than you can imagine. Riding up in the elevator, Richard received messages in sequence. Helen had discovered that Alison had scheduled video conferences with all board members individually the night before. Marina confirmed that Charles Peterson had arrived earlier and was in a closed meeting with Philip. Upon reaching the executive floor, Richard found the environment in an uproar. Executives were whispering in the corridors, and his secretary, Amanda, seemed especially nervous. Mr. Morrison, she approached quickly. Mrs. Allison left an envelope for you. Inside the envelope, Richard found only a card with a message written in his sister-in-law's elegant handwriting. Sometimes, to preserve a legacy, you need to change its form. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The boardroom was almost full when Richard entered. Philip was standing near the projection screen, animatedly conversing with Charles Peterson. Alison, seated at the table, was typing something on her laptop with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Ah, Richard, Philip smiled upon seeing him. Glad you could make it. We have exciting news about the merger. Richard observed his brother's face, looking for some sign of the young man who grew up beside him, who shared dreams and built an empire with him. Instead, he saw only a stranger wearing a familiar mask. Before we begin, Richard said, his voice calm but firm, I'd like to ask Alison a question. His sister-in-law raised her eyes from the laptop, her face a mask of professional serenity. Of course, Richard. What do you want to know? What was Hong Kong like in 2015, especially the offices of Golden Dragon Capital? The silence that followed Richard's question was deafening. Alison's serene expression faltered for a fraction of a second, so brief that only very attentive eyes could notice. Philip, who was about to start the presentation, froze with the projector remote in hand. "Hong Kong is a fascinating city," Alison answered with a studied smile. "But I don't understand the relevance of that question to our meeting today." Richard walked slowly to the conference table, placing his folder on it with deliberate calm. "It's interesting you say that, because I have here a rather revealing photo from that time. You, Charles Peterson, and some Golden Dragon Capital executives. Curious, isn't it? Especially considering that you supposedly only met Philip 2 years later." The air in the room grew heavy. Some board members shifted, uncomfortably in their chairs. Charles Peterson, who until then had maintained a neutral expression, nervously adjusted his tie. "Richard," Philip intervened, his voice tense, "this isn't the time for—" "On the contrary, brother," Richard gently interrupted him. "This is exactly the time. Before we vote on anything regarding the merger with Takeshi Corp, the board members deserve to know exactly who they're dealing with." Alison closed her laptop with a soft click and stood up, her posture impeccable. Her green eyes, once warm and friendly, now shone with a calculating intensity that Richard had never noticed before. "Do you really want to do this, Richard?" she asked, her voice low but clear. "Do you really want to expose family secrets in front of the board?" "Family secrets?" Richard laughed without humor. "No, Alison, you were never family. You were a carefully positioned piece in a much larger game." The other board members watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and horror. Amanda, who was taking notes of the meeting, had stopped typing, her widened eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. "Very well," Alison said, straightening her shoulders. "Since you want to play it this way," she gestured to Philip, who hesitated for a moment before handing her the projector remote. The screen behind her lit up, showing not the merger graphs everyone expected, but a series of old Morrison Group documents. Richard recognized some of them from the dead files he had just visited. "Members of the board," Alison began, her voice taking on a professional tone that Richard had never heard before, "what you see here is proof that the Morrison Group urgently needs restructuring. In the last 10 years under Richard's conservative management, we've lost crucial expansion opportunities." "And you naturally have the solution," Richard commented, his voice loaded with irony. "Yes, Richard, I do," she responded, clicking to the next slide. Golden Dragon Capital isn't just an investment fund. It's a bridge to the Asian market, an opportunity to transform the Morrison Group into a truly global player. Philip approached Alison, standing beside her in a clear show of support. "Richard, you've always been brilliant at building solid structures, but the world has changed. We need agility, international connections." "Connections?" Richard questioned, opening his folder and spreading some documents on the table. "Like these? Records of secret meetings, suspicious transfers, shell companies created in tax havens?" Board members leaned forward, trying to see the documents. Alison maintained her composure, but her fingers slightly tightened on the remote control. "You think you know Philip and Alison," Richard continued, addressing the board. "But what you don't know is that every step of the last 3 years was carefully choreographed. The acquisition of Peterson Technologies, it wasn't a market opportunity. It was the first step in a plan to weaken our governance structure." Charles Peterson abruptly stood up. "This is absurd. I won't sit here listening to—" "Sit down, Charles." Richard's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Or should I show the board the records of your meetings in Hong Kong with Golden Dragon? Those that happened long before the merger was even mentioned." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of the air conditioning. Alison looked at Richard with a mixture of respect and irritation, like a chess player who has just discovered that her opponent predicted her moves. "You're right about one thing, Richard," she finally said. "Nothing in the last 3 years was by chance. Every move, every decision, every acquisition, everything was part of a bigger plan. But you know what your mistake was? Thinking that makes our plan less legitimate." Alison walked to the boardroom window, her silhouette outlined against the New York skyline. When she turned again to face everyone, her expression had changed. There was no longer any pretense of cordiality, only a cold and professional determination. "You want to know the truth?" she asked, addressing the board members. "Yes, I worked in the Asian financial market. Yes, I knew Golden Dragon Capital long before I met Philip. And yes, every step was meticulously planned. But do you know why?" She clicked again on the remote, and the screen showed a series of comparative graphs. "Because the Morrison Group is falling behind. While our international competitors are aggressively expanding into new markets, we remain stuck in an outdated vision of management." "Outdated vision?" Richard interrupted, his voice controlled but firm. It was that vision that transformed a family business into one of the country's largest business groups. "And it's that same vision that will make us lose everything," Philip intervened, finally finding his voice. "Richard, you're brilliant at building solid structures, but the world has changed, the market has changed." Richard observed his brother with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "And you think the solution is to hand over everything we've built to a group of investors we barely know?" "Barely know," Alison laughed softly. "Richard, do you really think I spent the last 3 years just planning a hostile takeover? No, I built relationships, established connections, created a network of strategic partners that can take the Morrison Group to a level you can't even imagine." At that moment, Marina, who had been sitting discreetly at the back of the room, stood up. "Perhaps we should show the board the real numbers of Golden Dragon Capital, those that don't appear in the official reports." Alison narrowed her eyes upon seeing Marina. I knew someone was leaking information to Richard." "It's not leaking when it's about exposing the truth, Alison," Marina responded, walking to the table with her own folder of documents. "Golden Dragon isn't interested in strategic partnerships. They specialize in dismantling companies and selling their assets separately." The board began to murmur, and Richard realized the moment was crucial. He needed to act now before Alison could regain control of the situation. "Gentlemen," he addressed the board, "in the next few minutes I'm going to show you exactly how this supposed merger was architected. And more importantly, I'll reveal what's really at stake." Alison took a step forward, her professional composure beginning to show cracks. "Richard, think carefully about what you're going to do. Some truths, once revealed, cannot be forgotten." "You're right, Alison," Richard responded, taking a final document from his folder. "And that's why the board needs to know about the secret meeting in Singapore, the one that happened 3 months ago, where you and Philip met with the true owners of Golden Dragon Capital." Philip visibly paled. How do I know?" Richard completed. "Let's say you're not the only one who knows how to play this game, brother. The difference is that I never needed to betray my family to win." The silence that followed was deafening. Board members looked from Richard to Alison and Philip, trying to process the revelations unfolding before them. In the air hung an almost palpable tension, as if everyone knew that the next words would forever change the fate of the Morrison Group. Dr. Edward Montgomery, chairman of the board and personal friend of Richard and Philip's father, slowly rose from his chair. In his 40 years of career, he had never witnessed such a delicate situation. "Before we continue," he said, his grave voice echoing through the room, "I think everyone here deserves to know exactly what happened in Singapore." Richard nodded, taking a sealed envelope from his folder. "This report was prepared by an international investigation team. It details not only the Singapore meeting, but the entire operation of Golden Dragon Capital over the last 5 years." Alison stepped forward, her usual elegance replaced by an almost palpable urgency. "Richard, you don't understand. What we did in Singapore—" "What you did," Richard interrupted her, "was negotiate the complete sale of the Morrison Group to a Chinese consortium. But that wasn't all, was it, Alison?" Philip, who until then had maintained a defiant expression, began to show signs of nervousness. "Richard, you're distorting the facts." "Am I?" Richard opened the envelope and began distributing copies of the report to board members. "Page 47, gentlemen. Read carefully the details of the negotiations." A tense silence took over the room as the board members read the document. Charles Peterson, who until then had maintained a defensive posture, visibly paled. "This can't be true," murmured one of the board members. "But it is," Marina intervened, projecting a series of emails on the screen. "The plan was never her simple merger. Golden Dragon Capital is just the first phase of a much larger operation." Alison crossed her arms, her posture subtly changing. There was no longer any need to maintain the facade. "Do you really think the international market will wait for the Morrison Group to decide to evolve? While we remain stuck in outdated values, our competitors are redefining the rules of the game." "Outdated values?" Richard questioned, his voice laden with contained emotion. "It was with those values that our father built this empire. It was with those values that we transformed a family business into a national powerhouse." "Your father," Alison began. But something in her voice made Richard abruptly raise his eyes. "What about my father?" he asked, a sudden chill running down his spine. Alison's silence was more revealing than any answer. Philip, sensing the change in atmosphere, tried to intervene, but Richard was already connecting the dots. "Marina," he called without taking his eyes off Alison. "Show them file B17. Marina quickly typed on her laptop, and a new series of documents appeared on the screen. They were old records dated almost 20 years ago. 2 decades ago, Richard began, his voice now lower but charged with an intensity that made everyone in the room lean forward. "Our father refused a merger offer from an international group. At the time, he said it was because he wanted to maintain family control of the company. But there was more, wasn't there, Alison?" Alison kept her gaze fixed on Richard, but a muscle in her jaw slightly contracted. "The group that made the offer," Richard continued, "was controlled by the Wong family, your family, Alison." Board members exchanged surprised looks. Philip stepped forward, confusion evident on his face. "What are you talking about, Richard?" "I'm talking," Richard responded, without taking his eyes off Alison, "that our dear sister-in-law didn't enter our lives by chance. Her family has been trying to take control of the Morrison Group for 2 decades. Alison finally smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Impressive, Richard. Truly impressive. How long did it take you to discover everything?" "Long enough," he replied. "What I still don't understand is why wait so long? Why all this elaborate charade?" "Because your father was too smart," she responded, finally abandoning all pretense. "He immediately perceived our intentions, but you and Philip, you were different, more ambitious, more susceptible to external influences." Philip stepped back as if he had been slapped. "Alison, what are you saying?" "Oh, darling." She turned to him with an almost pitying expression. "Did you really think it was all for love? That of all the women in New York, I coincidentally fell in love with the heir of the group my family had been trying to control for years?" The impact of these words seemed physical on Philip's face. Richard felt a wave of compassion for his brother, despite everything that had happened. "But you made a mistake, Alison," Richard said, taking a final document from his folder. "You underestimated how much our father taught us about loyalty." The last document that Richard held looked incredibly ordinary. A simple sheet of Morrison Group letterhead, yellowed by time. But when he began to read its contents, Alison's face lost all color. "Impossible," she whispered. "That was destroyed." "Did you really think our father wouldn't leave some protection?" Richard asked, his voice soft but firm. "This document, members of the board, is an agreement signed 20 years ago between our father and Alison's father. An agreement that she believed had been eliminated." Marina projected a digitized copy of the document on the screen. It was a contract that clearly established that any future attempt at hostile acquisition of the Morrison Group by the Wong family would result in the activation of a special clause, the automatic transfer of all Asian participations of the group to a foundation exclusively controlled by the Morrison family. "In other words," Richard continued, "if the merger with Golden Dragon is approved, the Wong family automatically loses everything they've built in Asia over the last 50 years. Alison staggered slightly, leaning on the conference table. All her aristocratic composure had disappeared, replaced by an expression of absolute disbelief. "You wouldn't do that," she said, but her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Wouldn't I?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "You bet everything on the idea That I was too conservative, too predictable to make such an aggressive move. That was your mistake, Alison. You studied the businessman but forgot to study the man. Philip, who had remained silent, processing the revelation of the true reason for his marriage, finally found his voice. Why, Alison? Why all this manipulation? You could have proposed a legitimate partnership. Partnership? She laughed, a bitter sound. Your family would never accept a true partnership with us. Your father made that very clear 20 years ago. The only way was to take complete control. And you didn't care about destroying lives. In the process, Marina commented, her voice loaded with contempt. Business is business, Alison responded coldly. Feelings are a weakness we can't afford to have. That's where your biggest mistake lies, Richard intervened. You confused principles with weakness, loyalty with naivety, and now, he made a gesture encompassing the room. You've lost everything. Dr. Montgomery cleared his throat, calling everyone's attention. I believe that in light of these revelations, we need an immediate vote on the merger proposal. That won't be necessary, a new voice sounded from the door. Everyone turned to see Margaret Chen entering, accompanied by two Asian executives whom Alison clearly recognized, judging by her expression of shock. Mr. Wong, Alison whispered, seeing her own father enter the room. Daughter, the man said in an icy tone, you not only failed in your mission, but compromised 2 decades of family planning. The Golden Dragon Board has just voted for the complete withdrawal of our merger proposal. Richard observed the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and regret. There was no pleasure in seeing a family fall apart, even if it was the family that had tried to destroy his own. Philip, he addressed his brother, who seemed completely lost. I know you need time to process all this, but when you're ready, my door will always be open. Dr. Montgomery stood up again. Gentlemen, I believe this meeting is adjourned. Mr. Morrison, congratulations on protecting your father's legacy. As board members began to leave, Richard realized that something fundamental had changed in that room. It wasn't just the end of a corporate conspiracy, it was the end of an era of innocence, of blind trust. Marina approached, him discreetly. What happens now? Richard observed Alison being confronted by her father in a corner of the room, Philip leaving alone through the door, carrying the weight of 2 decades of lies on his shoulders. Now, he responded, we rebuild. Stronger, wiser, but without losing the values that brought us here. 3 months passed since the meeting that forever changed the fate of the Morrison Group. The afternoon New York sun streamed through the windows of the executive penthouse, where Richard observed the city that had been the stage for so many transformations in his life. Marina entered the room carrying a folder with the latest reports. The quarterly numbers are in, Richard. Surprisingly, we're doing better than expected. It's not so surprising, he responded, turning to face her. Sometimes a storm is needed to strengthen the roots. The past few months had been intense. After Alison's departure, returning to Hong Kong with her family in disgrace, the market speculated about the Morrison Group's stability, but Richard had learned important lessons from the entire experience. How's Philip? Marina asked softly, placing the reports on the desk. Richard sighed, remembering the last meeting with his brother. Better. He's at a retreat in Vermont. Said he needs time to rebuild his identity, in his words. And you? How are you dealing with all this? Richard walked to the window, observing the New York skyline. You know, Marina, in the last few months I've thought a lot about what our father always said. That an empire isn't built just with numbers and contracts, but with trust and values. At that moment, Amanda entered hurriedly into the room. Mr. Morrison, call from Dr. Montgomery on line 1. He says it's about the new international partnership proposal. Richard exchanged a significant look with Marina before answering. After the scandal with Golden Dragon, several legitimate international companies had shown interest in strategic partnerships with the Morrison Group. The group's reputation for integrity had, ironically, strengthened after the crisis. Edward, Richard answered, using the board chairman's first name, something he had recently started doing. Yes, I received the documents from the German company. No, I don't want to rush anything. Let's do it the right way this time. After hanging, Richard turned to Marina. You were right from the beginning, you know. When you approached me with your suspicions about Allison. Marina smiled discreetly. Actually, it was you who always knew. You just needed to trust your instincts. A movement at the door caught the attention of both. It was Margaret Chen, who had become an unexpected ally in recent months. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, entering the room with her characteristic elegance. But I thought you'd like to know, Richard. Golden Dragon Capital is undergoing a complete restructuring. The Wong family has lost control of the board. Richard nodded slowly. The news didn't surprise him, but it didn't bring him satisfaction either. And Allison? Working at an investment bank in Shanghai, Margaret responded. Under another name, of course. Apparently, even there, the Wong surname has lost its prestige. Richard's phone vibrated. It was a message from Philip. Can we talk? I'm coming back to New York next week. You know, Richard said, showing the message to Marina and Margaret, amid all this conspiracy, I ended up learning something important about family. What? Marina asked. That sometimes true family isn't the one that shares our blood, but the one that shares our values, he responded, looking significantly at the two women who had proven so crucial in recent months. Margaret smiled. Speaking of values, the German investors are impressed with how you handled the whole situation. They specifically mentioned the Morrison Group's integrity as a decisive factor for the partnership. Integrity, Richard repeated the word thoughtful. You know what's ironic? Allison and her father tried to destroy us because they thought our values were our weakness. And in the end, Marina completed, those were precisely the values that saved us. Richard picked up a picture frame from his desk, an old photo where he and Philip, still children, smiled next to their father in front of the first Morrison Group headquarters. Our father always said that a business is like a tree. You can force its growth with chemicals, but if the roots aren't strong and healthy, it won't survive the first storm, Marina completed, remembering the phrase she had heard Richard quote before. The sun was beginning to set over New York, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. Richard observed the city once more, thinking about how the past weeks had changed his perspective on so many things. A week later, Richard anxiously waited at Le Bernardin, the same restaurant where so many important revelations had occurred months before. Philip had requested this meeting, the first since he had left for his retreat in Vermont. When his brother entered the restaurant, Richard barely recognized him. Philip was thinner, tanned, and there was something different in his eyes, a serenity. That replaced the former ambitious restlessness. Richard, Philip embraced him, a gesture that caught the older brother by surprise. Thank you for coming. The two sat down, and for a few moments they just observed each other, decades of shared history hanging between them. You look different, Richard commented. Philip smiled slightly. 3 months on a farm in Vermont will do that to you. But it wasn't just the change of environment, it was the change in perspective. The waiter brought the menus, but neither seemed particularly interested in food at that moment. Richard, Philip began, his voice laden with contained emotion. I need to apologize to you, not just for what I did, but for having doubted everything our father taught us. Richard studied his brother's face, looking for and finding the sincerity that had always characterized Philip before that whole story began. You know what I discovered during this time away? Philip continued. That Allison didn't manipulate me just with false love. She manipulated my own insecurity, my desire to prove that I could be more than just the younger brother. Philip. No, let me finish. Philip raised his hand. I spent so much time trying to get out of your shadow that I didn't realize I was entering a much greater darkness. Richard felt his eyes moisten. You were never in my shadow, brother. You were always my partner, my equal. Now I know that, Philip responded, a sad smile on his lips. But I had to lose everything to understand. You haven't lost everything, Richard said firmly. Your chair on the board is still there. Your family, your real family, is still here. Philip swallowed hard, clearly emotional. Even after everything I did, especially after everything that happened, Richard responded. Because now you understand, just as I understood, that the true value of an empire isn't in the numbers in bank accounts, but in the principles that sustain it. At that moment, Richard's cell phone vibrated with a message from Marina. German proposal unanimously approved by the board. We begin a new era. Richard showed the message to Philip, who read it with genuine interest. The Germans, they're different from Golden Dragon? Completely, Richard confirmed. Real strategic partners with values aligned with ours. The kind of partnership our father always wanted for the group. Our father, Philip murmured. He always knew, didn't he? About the Wong family, about everything. Yes, Richard nodded. And he prepared us even without us knowing. Each lesson, each principle he insisted on teaching us. It wasn't about business. It was about character. The brothers spent the following hours talking, reminiscing memories, reconnecting. When they finally left the restaurant, the sun had already set. But something new had been born. A deeper understanding. A stronger bond that no corporate conspiracy could break. The next day, when Richard entered his office, he found an old, framed photo on his desk, him and Philip still children next to their father. Along with it was a note from his brother. To remember where we came from and, more importantly, what we're made of, Philip. Richard smiled, placing the photo in a prominent place. The Morrison Group had survived its greatest crisis not because of brilliant corporate strategies or astute financial maneuvers, but because its roots, planted with solid values and watered with unwavering principles, were strong enough to withstand any storm.